Most people barely leave a mark on the canvas of history. Some enjoy a few years of fame for their talent as entertainers, politicians, athletes, and scientists. And then there are those whose deeds, both good and bad, make them interesting enough for us to cover on The Memoirist. But there are some people who truly do change the course of history. People who make a large enough impact on the world that their names live on for millennia. There's the pharaoh Tutankhamun and colonial warlord Alexander the Great. You've got the Roman dictator Julius Caesar, Francophile Napoleon Bonaparte, and Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace. And then there is the most vile and evil of them all, Adolf Hitler, leader of the Nazi Party, and the man responsible not only for the bloodiest conflict of all time, but for the genocide of 6 million European Jews, and perhaps as many as 13 million more innocent civilians. Adolf Hitler was an indisputably horrible human, responsible for some of the most awful hate speech, as well as racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, and ableist policies in history. Almost anyone who's ever taken so much as one high school history class knows about the Nazis, about their defeat in World War II, and about the terrible Holocaust they wrought upon the world. Yet, comparatively few of us really know much about Hitler as a person. We know the legend, but not the man. What was his childhood like? What made him develop such violent anti-Semitism? Was he really celibate, like he pretended to be? Or was he bisexual? Were his secret sexual escapades perhaps too R-rated even for YouTube? And what effect did a daily cocktail of amphetamine, morphine, and cocaine have on the Führer's body and mind? Join us as we reveal the man behind the monster. What makes a monster? The childhood of Adolf Hitler. As we touched upon in our Ted Bundy video, you can usually trace the origin story of murderers back to traumatic events in their childhood. When we're young and our brains are malleable, unstable circumstances can turn even the sweetest little child into an unhinged monster. Of course, plenty of people have troubled childhoods and don't turn out to be serial killers or dictators. Events like these can never excuse crimes committed in later life, but they can offer some explanation. Adolf Hitler was born in the small, picturesque town of Braunau am Inn on the Austro-Hungarian-German border on the 20th of April, 1889. He was a cute baby and a miracle child in the eyes of his mother Clara and father Alois, whose previous 3 children had all died in infancy, which could well have had something to do with the fact that Alois and Clara were second cousins. From the outset, baby Adolf was doted on by his adoring mother. His father, on the other hand, was not so kind. It appears that Alois Hitler was more than a little too fond of Austrian beer. He would frequently unleash his violent, drunken temper on his wife, and often in front of the children. Though evidence is unclear, it's quite possible that, at times, the infant Adolf also bore the brunt of his father's rage. Even at a young age, Alois's unpredictable behavior began to rub off on his son. In an excerpt from her childhood diary, Hitler's sister Paula wrote, "Once again, I felt my brother's hand land on my face." Hitler rarely saw eye to eye with his father, who wanted him to follow in his footsteps as a customs agent. But Adolf refused. He was artistic, with a fondness for singing and painting, and so was always pushing back against the strict rules his teachers set. Young Adolf dreamed instead of attending a classical high school and pursuing a career in the arts. Alois, in a typical fatherly move, ignored his son's wishes and sent him instead to the Realschule in Linz in September 1900. That year, Adolf Hitler, just 11 years old, would experience the first of several major childhood traumas destined to completely alter his life's path. At the same time that his dad was crushing his creative dreams, His little 6-year-old brother Edmund died of measles. The change in Adolf was almost instantaneous. From an energetic, charming, and outgoing young boy, he became quiet, depressed, and difficult to deal with. He fought with his teachers more than ever and stopped participating in class. Most crucially, the death of his brother and the crumbling relationship with his father pushed a prepubescent Hitler toward darker, more sinister ideas of identity, including a heightened sense of German nationalism and a disdain for his own country's monarchy, which Hitler saw as representing a multicultural and multi-ethnic society. Just 3 years after the death of young Edmund, Hitler faced another loss, that of his father. With Alois out of the picture, Adolf's behavior at school deteriorated even further. After barely passing his second attempt at the high school final exam in 1905, Clara Hitler's golden boy finally got the opportunity he'd always wanted: to leave the small town life behind and head for Vienna, the Mecca for European artists. But Hitler's life was not about to become happier anytime soon. Without a high school diploma and untrained in fine art, he struggled to stand out from the Viennese crowd. His skills as a watercolorist were certainly above average, but in the milieu of talented painters living and working in the Austrian capital, Adolf's efforts went undiscovered. He was forced to turn to manual labor and sleeping in homeless shelters just to survive. Following back-to-back rejections from Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, the 18-year-old future dictator of Germany probably thought he couldn't sink any lower. But then came the news that his mother was dying. Hitler rushed home, devoting his mother's final months to her care and well-being. But by that point, her breast cancer had already grown too virulent. Clara Hitler died at the age of 47 on the 21st of December, 1907. When the Hitler's family doctor, himself Jewish, was later asked about Adolf's relationship with his mother, he said that he'd never seen a stronger mother-son bond, and that the boy had been spoiled by Clara, who let him have his way whenever she could. The doctor also recounted witnessing Hitler's emotions at his mother's funeral. "In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler." If his younger brother's death had turned him from a rosy-cheeked boy into a sulky teenager, the death of his mother irreversibly changed Hitler. His outlook on life would never quite be the same. Returning to Vienna, Adolf buried himself in hateful anti-Semitic and ethno-nationalist literature, abandoned by almost everyone he'd ever loved, and constantly told he wasn't good enough, whether in school or in art. Hitler was captivated by the attention which populist right-wing speakers received when orating on the streets of the capital. It was also around this time that his sister, Paula Hitler, guesses he might have found another reason to vilify Europe's Jews. It's possible that Adolf might have held the Jewish art dealers of Vienna personally responsible for his failure to make it as a painter. After a childhood of abuse, deaths in the family, and constant failure, it is perhaps no wonder that when the First World War broke out in 1914, the angry, radicalized 19-year-old Hitler was eager to enlist. Finally found his niche: World War I and the rise of the Nazis. It's no small irony that Adolf Hitler's acceptance into the Bavarian army was not owed to his actual ability to fight, but rather to a clerical error. He was, after all, a native of Austria-Hungary and should not technically have been able to enlist in the German armed forces. Hitler had also failed his first army medical exam and had been deemed unfit for military service, probably due to the many illnesses which plagued him throughout life, as we'll discuss a little later. Nevertheless, Hitler persisted, and when he eventually got to the Western Front, he proved himself time and time again as a competent soldier. As a messenger, he saw action at the Battle of the Somme, Ypres, and Passchendaele, earning the Iron Cross first and second class for his bravery. In another bitter twist of irony, he was awarded these medals of honor by his Jewish superiors. Adolf also earned the Black Wound Badge in 1918, following a shell wound inflicted during the Battle of the Somme. Later, he suffered temporary blindness from a mustard gas attack and was forced to recover in hospital. It was there, lying in bed, that the much-decorated soldier learned of his beloved country's surrender. According to his own account, the shock of defeat was so great that he went blind for a second time. Of course, the reasons Germany and its allies lost the First World War are plain as day to us now. After the USA added its astonishing weight to the fight, it was only a matter of time before the Central Powers would collapse. But to Hitler and many hundreds of thousands of other disaffected German youth who had fought so hard and won many battles in the war, defeat seemed inexplicable. Instead, they looked for a scapegoat, and with anti-Semitism already rampant throughout Europe, it wasn't long until they found one. The Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back myth, refers to the popular but unfounded belief among German soldiers and nationalists that their home country had not so much been defeated as it had been betrayed. This myth quickly became a central pillar of Hitler's racist worldview. He wholeheartedly believed that Germany had been betrayed by Marxists and Jews on the home front, who had unnecessarily surrendered, signing the harsh Treaty of Versailles and shaming Germany in the process by effectively accepting full responsibility for the war. The Germany to which an angry and upset Adolf returned was becoming increasingly divided, fractured into the ineffectual centrist government, the extreme left, and the extreme right. And we all know how that story ends. Strangely enough, Hitler's post-war introduction to fascist politics came not through underground channels, but by direct order of his employers, the German army. Whilst working as an intelligence officer in the aftermath of World War I, Adolf was assigned to infiltrate the extremist German Workers' Party, or the DAP, which would, in time, become known as the Nazi Party. Again, working on army orders, he applied to join the DAP and was accepted. Once in, Adolf quickly made a name for himself as a skilled speaker. He caught the attention of DAP party chairman Anton Drexler, who continued Hitler's anti-Semitic and nationalist education. Just 4 days after attending his first DAP meeting, Hitler drafted a now infamous letter by orders of his army captain, addressing the so-called Jewish question. Today, the Gemlich letter is regarded as the first verifiable evidence of Hitler's genocidal intentions for the Jewish people. In it, Hitler not only demeans and dehumanizes the entire Jewish people, stating that their presence is a racial tuberculosis of the nation, he also says this: "Our final objective, however, must be the total removal of all Jews from our midst." Soon, Hitler began moving swiftly up the party ranks and further away from his role as an army spy. One of the founders of the DAP, Dietrich Eckart, took Adolf under his wing as an apprentice, showing him the ropes of politics and preparing him for power. Moreover, Hitler began to prove himself as the frighteningly charismatic face of German fascism. He delivered regular speeches to enchanted audiences in the beer halls around Munich, and even designed a banner for the newly named Nationalist Social German Workers' Party, or Nazis. His inverted black swastika in a white circle on a red background has become one of the most enduring symbols of our time. It was key to the cultish control Hitler was later able to exert over not just the majority of German citizens, but upon right-wing supporters all around the world. As a creative youngster, Adolf had been told time and time again that he was no good. He failed school tests, disappointed his father, lost his mother, and barely scraped a living as a street artist in Vienna. But now, as the freshly appointed 32-year-old chairman of the Nazi Party, he was suddenly revered. His art, in the form of the swastika banner, was being flown in the streets by people who gathered in their hundreds and then in their thousands to watch him speak. These people hung on his every word, so long as he told them what they wanted to hear. That their poverty, their pains, their woes and shames were all the fault of Jews and Bolsheviks, and that if they would only vote his party into power, he would make Germany great again. Sound familiar? Hitler the Romantic. Suicide and murder. Unfortunately, we all know too well what happened next. The once outgoing and lovable boy from the Austrian countryside, embittered and radicalized by his upbringing, successfully won the hearts of Germany with his populist rhetoric. As dictator of a fascist state, he ruthlessly consolidated power via blackmail, strong-arming, and murder. He embroiled the world in the bloodiest war in history, and he ordered his most extreme and violently intolerant lieutenants to systematically slaughter as many as 19.3 million Jews, homosexuals, Roma, gypsies, disabled people, communists, and other so-called undesirables. In the end, Hitler's megalomaniacal grip on power was also his downfall. Overstretching the Reich and failing to concede control of military tactics to men much more skilled and experienced than he, Hitler's Germany was eventually beaten by the Allies. Sick, delusional, and ultimately defeated, Hitler and his longtime lover-turned-wife for a day, Eva Braun, killed themselves by poison and gunshot. But still, the question remains. Who was this man? What on earth could drive someone to commit acts of such indescribable evil? A traumatic childhood may explain the origins of his hatefulness, but it cannot account for everything. For that, we need to delve a little deeper, starting with his love life. The version of himself that Adolf Hitler portrayed to the public was a far stretch from reality. Outwardly, Hitler lived a chaste and celibate life, an image he cultivated quite deliberately, in order to suggest to the public that he was too busy working hard for Germany to indulge in romantic affairs. In private, however, he was something of a Lothario. Over the years, Adolf displayed a curious array of sexual exploration, much of which remains in contention to this day. Some historians, for example, have argued that Hitler engaged in homosexual relationships during his time in the army, and homophobia may have been the reason that his superiors neglected to promote him any higher. Other biographers of the Führer have argued that he might instead have been asexual, exhibiting no real sexual desire toward any gender. Most shocking indeed are the allegations from his former lovers, as well as psychological profiles drafted by the likes of the CIA's predecessor, the OSS, which suggest Hitler was an impotent coprophile. Whilst we can't go into more detail about coprophilia here on YouTube, we suggest you look it up if you're not too faint-hearted. Still, we needn't pay heed to potential hearsay to learn more about Hitler's psyche. His romantic track record speaks for itself. Hitler's partners were almost always significantly younger than him, and were repeatedly the subject of his jealous tendencies. As a boyfriend, Hitler was petty, envious, paranoid, and domineering. He could even be aggressive and vengeful if he didn't get his way, and would reportedly ask his partners to perform increasingly disturbing sexual favors for him, in which he played the submissive the deeper into the relationship he got. One particularly sad story starts with Geli Raubel, Hitler's half-niece. She and her half-uncle were reportedly engaged in an intimate relationship in the years before he met Eva Braun. Adolf was so jealous of Geli's apparent flirtations with his chauffeur Emil Maurice, that he would lock her up inside his Munich apartment and not let her leave. Then, in September of 1931, Geli was found dead in that very same apartment, Hitler's gun by her side and a bullet in her head. Whilst the Nazi propaganda machine worked quickly to imply suicide, many have instead suggested that Adolf's half-niece was in fact the victim of murder. Geli's corpse apparently sported a broken nose, a sign that Hitler may have hit and then killed his incestuous lover during a fight. Murder or not, Geli Raubal was not the first nor the last of Hitler's partners to die a violent death. At least 3 more of the Führer's lovers either attempted or actually died by suicide. And if that doesn't tell you something about the type of man Adolf Hitler was, then what will? Well, perhaps this. The mystery of Hitler's health. Schizophrenic or addicted killer? From the time of Hitler's barbaric reign until the modern day, a smorgasbord of psychologists, biographers, historians, and doctors have attempted to psychoanalyze the Führer in an attempt to explain what could have led one man to do so much damage to the world. He has been posthumously labeled with mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder, psychopathy, and schizophrenia, as well as with depression, from which it appears he most likely did suffer, hysteria, or dissociative disorder, and borderline personality disorder. There are, of course, a multitude of troubling signs in Hitler's history of hate speech and violence which point to such diagnoses. For one, his irrefutable belief in his own power and brilliance as a military leader, when all signs were pointing to his evident failings, have been taken as a clear display of schizophrenia in action, as has Hitler's ardent assertion that he alone was chosen to lead the German people against their supposed sworn enemy, the Jews. There are a few problems, however, with diagnosing Hitler. For one, as far as we know, he never saw a psychiatrist in his lifetime. Thus, we can only guess as to his mental health condition based on secondary evidence. Secondly, diagnosing Hitler as, for example, schizophrenic might then be used to almost pardon his policies. If he was indeed schizophrenic, you could perhaps argue that the genocidal Holocaust and final solution were in fact the policies of a madman who was not responsible for his own actions. Not only would such a suggestion be incredibly upsetting to millions of descendants of Holocaust survivors, it would also be tenuous at best. In recent years, a much more likely explanation for Hitler's erratic extremism has emerged, one which is grounded in the understanding that he was very much conscious of his actions and did indeed hold the evil views for which he gained his infamy. Thanks largely to the investigative work of German writer Norman Ohler in his book Blitzed: Drugs in Nazi Germany, we now know that, at the very height of his power, Adolf Hitler was ingesting a daily cocktail of amphetamines, cocaine, opiates, barbiturates, animal fat, and deadly nightshade, fed to him by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. Considered something of a quack celebrity doctor in his time, Theo Morell nevertheless somehow wormed his way into Hitler's inner circle. Once there, he began to administer the Führer with an unchecked regimen of daily injections, sometimes numbering in the dozens, in ham-fisted attempts to combat the German Chancellor's many ailments, which may have included irritable bowel syndrome, skin lesions, irregular heartbeat, coronary sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, late-stage syphilis, giant cell arteritis, and tinnitus, as well as depression or bipolar. Perhaps unbeknownst to Hitler, however, Morell was not treating him with regular medicine, but instead with amphetamine, a precursor to today's street meth, morphine and other opiates, and a bucket load of cocaine. Very quickly, the Führer became wholly dependent upon Morell for his daily fix. As the years wore on and the stresses and strains of governing the losing side in a world war took their toll, Hitler's health plummeted. So too did his capacity for rational thought. Spurred on by equally evil men like Goebbels, Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's genocide of the Jews and other non-Aryans escalated in terms of both speed and ferocity, fueled by his lifelong extremism and now a serious addiction to hard drugs. Hitler's grip on reality slipped and then disappeared altogether. In the end, his death brought about the collapse of fervent Nazism like a bubble bursting. Almost as one, Germany awoke from a long and terrible dream. The Führer was dead, and so too was the nightmare. Had circumstances been different, Adolf Hitler might have turned out to be just like any other ordinary Austrian farmer or clerk. But instead he grew to become one of the most powerfully evil men of all time. Why? Because of a very rare and toxic combination of factors, stemming from his many childhood and teenage traumas, through the horrors of war, to the extreme views of the society around him, a fractious and unsettling love life, and a health record characterized by mental health issues and the kind of drug use that would have killed Keith Richards. With any luck, the creation of monsters like Adolf Hitler happens once in a billion. With any luck, society has learned from its mistakes and will never create another Hitler ever again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see others like it, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons down below.